Have you ever flipped the script and wondered how rich people lived during the Depression? In a time when most were barely getting by, could the wealthy still be savoring rare wines and reclining on silk sheets? Or were they forced to let go of their luxuries like the rest of the world? Stuff like foie gras was honestly just as expensive as you'd think back in the day. During the 30s, a modest rate for foie gras, and I mean, this was really as reasonable as it got, was around $4 to $5 per pound for the stuff. That was the going price in high-end markets, and if you count for inflation today, we're basically talking about spending $80 or $100 on the stuff. The dishes themselves were around $4 to $5 in most restaurants too, and I know you might be thinking that's not a lot, but you gotta put into perspective just how much the average man was making back then. A weekly paycheck was around $15 to $20 if you were lucky, so we're talking about spending a quarter of an honest week's pay on just fancy food. The ultra-wealthy still find ways, though. Economic droughts never really hit the same for them. While a lot of people counted their days on sips of bone broth and water, in New York and Chicago, a lot of these people were still enjoying foie gras as if things were honestly normal. It was honestly out of the question for anyone remotely living on a normal annual income to afford fancy imported food from France. But that's just rich people for you. Duck à l'orange was a bit less of a luxury than foie gras. Don't take that the wrong way, though. It was still definitely a premium dish that you'd only get if you were properly loaded back then, or if you had saved up. A plate then was around $4 to $6, and ducks weren't actually most of the cost of that. It was the oranges, which were pretty seasonal. Plus, not every state had orange growing capabilities, so when areas like that served this, the price went a little higher too. It was also one of those things you'd only find in a fancy French restaurant. Average families were sticking to making faux pudding out of molasses and going for no-bake cakes, but the upper class still managed to enjoy some fine poultry during the stock market crash that left the nation shook. Kids that grew up on a farmer's income and kids that grew up with their daddy having been affected by that stock market crash directly because he had stock just have different values. For the former, it was a lot more common to forage for fresh berries. Scraping and scavenging what you could find, and, if you were lucky, bringing back a pile big enough to share with the family was a common habit of lower-class or working-class families. Berries were just $2 to $4 per pint back then, and they were mostly imported since a lot of places didn't naturally grow berries. This was especially true for people that lived in big, sprawling cities. All those buildings and subways don't really make for prime berry-growing ground after all. It was more common for rich people to still eat these, though, and they didn't have to spend parts of their day trekking through the muck and woods to scavenge for it either. Not only did they eat berries and buy them regularly, they also used to still buy things like maraschino cherries and enjoy other berry-based dishes that called for heavy use of the fruit. Feeling better about that 9 to 5 yet? I know I'm not. This one surprised me, and I think it'll take you for a spin too. Off the top of your head, how much do you think lobster costs, especially back then? Maybe $4 to $7? A bit more if you're eating at some really well-known place? Yeah, that was my guess too. So I thought, rich people definitely could get this. It turns out both you and I would be right. Rich people could definitely get it, but a lot more than we're imagining, because lobster cost a lot less than we're imagining. The actual rates for lobster back then were as little as 10 to 20 cents in coastal areas and in cities with no access to seafood, ones that relied on coastal areas to trade with them for it. It cost around $2 to $4. Lobster dishes themselves were still around $2 to $3, which still makes them more expensive than the average person could afford back then, but not enough that the average rich real estate owner couldn't get his hands on some too. Also, lobster was especially cheap in New England, and it was consumed so plentifully there that it became known as poor man's food. Even in New York, elite establishments like the 21 Club and Delmonico's, the ones that only catered to the rich, always served a pretty curated menu of lobster and other seafood. Filet mignon is still what I'd expected it to be. One of the priciest cuts of meat, it comes right from tenderloin, which was pretty scarce and expensive during the recession following the crash. It sold for 50 to 60 cents per pound, which meant that most dishes back then cost around $3 to $5 per plate. For most people, it was out of the question. Seriously, try to view it in the bigger picture. If you take a look at America as a whole, a lot of people were mixing sawdust to make bread dough or wearing clothes with holes in them. So quirky little escapades into the nightlife of New York and Chicago with fine wine and filet mignons were just not really a realistic idea or a priority for most people. In more blunt words, it was out of the question because bills had to be paid. So restaurants that catered to just the well-off families of the United States only became more laser-focused on their clientele. The Stork Club, the Pump Room, and the Waldorf Astoria are some popular restaurants that served expensive filet mignon dishes back then, and they still got a lot of traction out of it. Smoked salmon was even more expensive than the other two we just went over. This is because tenderloin was still something you would find in cattle grown right in the US, and lobster was still something you could fish, but salmon was imported right from Europe or some really niche coastal areas that were cornerstones of the fishing industry but had remote populations and no fine dining culture. A pound of salmon cost $1 to $2, meaning a plate was around $5 to $7 at the best of places and around $2 to $3 at most. New York had places like the Russian Tea Room, which made a big name for itself off of its reputation for serving some of the finest smoked salmon you could find. And of course, rich people flocked like moths to a flame to places like that. For a lot of these people, it's not just the taste, experience, or even the thrill of having a fine premium dish. It's also the status symbol aspect of it all. They get to enjoy and eat what no one can and maintain a lifestyle completely detached from what everyone else is experiencing, and that really gets them going. Bananas Foster was a fancy American dessert that actually was made with baking ingredients and rum. The thing is, like I mentioned before, a lot of people had come up with mock and no-bake versions of popular desserts because even basic pantry staples like butter, flour, eggs, and thickening agents were missing. Forget things like frosting and whipped cream, but no, Banana Foster made use of all that and more. It was first made at Brennan's in New Orleans, and the caramelized bananas were what really caught on with people. Of course, when the normal folk could have afforded it in better times, when layoffs weren't a national experience for everyone, it was something they enjoyed too. But right in the heart of the Depression, only the rich could have afforded things like this. Bananas were usually imported out of Central America back then, but they aren't that expensive. It was all the other baking ingredients that would be used for this dish, which made it out of the reach of most people who didn't have fat bank accounts. There were these two restaurants back in the day in New Orleans that were really known for their Banana Foster, and that was Antoine's and Galatoire's in New Orleans. They got a name for making use of bananas in other desserts though, but their Foster was a real knockout. So the most expensive item on this list that breaks past even the $4 to $7 bracket isn't a cut of meat like Wagyu or some kind of fine seafood like caviar or even a fancy wine, but actually just truffles. The more rare a truffle was, like the top-of-the-line imported black or white ones, and these usually came right out of Europe, the more expensive it would be per ounce. The established rate that most people were working off just to make a truffle-selling business break even or be profitable was $4 to $6 per ounce, which means it would make it around $60 to $80 per pound. That's about for people's salary for a week, man. That's a bit dystopian if you ask me. It was definitely considered a massive luxury, and only high-end fancy French and Italian places were fond of serving truffle-based dishes, but the intended effect worked. It attracted rich clientele better than anything else, as a lot of them were eager to get the precious truffles they had become so used to before imports started to slow down during the Depression. Even then, rich people had their ways. Pheasant was a wild game bird, but it was considered a rare delicacy. It wasn't the most expensive thing, at least if we're talking about rich people's money, but it was costly. A bird would usually reach $1 to $2, which meant that dishes were for $3 to $4. The real issue with pheasant was that it took a lot of work to store it properly. That meant that only specialized restaurants with top-of-the-line chefs knew how to make the best use of pheasant, and they charged accordingly for their skill and labor. That was also a part of why pheasant was something that was considered luxury dining preserved for the rich. Even if you did find an affordable pheasant at a local joint in states where it was hunted and so it was a bit more accessible, you weren't sure if you could trust the chef to make the best use of the bird. If you wanted to go and have a real pheasant dish, you'd have to step into a fancy place with chefs that were worth the money. The Depression was a bit of a weird time for wine lovers and winemakers. I mean, sure, domestic winemaking was growing firmly as a respectable industry, though it had the obvious setbacks most people were facing during the Depression. However, it wasn't able to capture the biggest market, which was the upper elite class. They were still very much hung up on their imported French delicacies, which were really considered some of the best bottles you could pop open in the entire world. Some of the most famous French wines like Chateau Lafite Rothschild, Chateau Margaux, French Bordeaux, and some other fancy categories of wine like Burgundy, among which Corton Charlemagne and Domaine de la Romanée Conti were extremely popular. Think of the market for these things as really niche and selective, but incredibly dense and active. A bottle of these would cost as much as smoked salmon or truffles, so if you ever stepped into someone's house and they had bottles like these on display, you just knew they were loaded. Not that houses like that were common during the Depression. Yet another aspect of French culture that America as a country could never do away with, even in times as harsh and frugal as the Depression, was brie cheese. This was a really special kind of cheese because it had this incredibly soft texture with a rich, creamy interior and a bloomy rind that made it top dog in the cheese world. Everyone was singing the praises of brie cheese and how it was yet another culinary goldmine discovered by the French, forever enriching the food scene globally. Imported French brie was around 30 to 50 cents per pound, and popular brands from regions known for their cheesemaking like Brie de Meaux and Brie de Melun were even more expensive. You could expect prices to go up to $1 or $2 for a pound, but if you wanted genuine, authentic brie cheese, and I mean the real stuff, absolute genuine article, then you'd have to go to novelty shops that specialize in cheese. High-end grocery stores were one thing, but they were still buying in bulk and from people that were mass-producing cheese to make a pretty penny. They didn't have the love of the game that specialty shops did. The cheese they would sell would be genuinely some of the best cheese you could find in terms of imports. We're still not done with France. It's just something you have to wrap your head around. The 20th century was dominated by our exploration of French food culture and their cuisines, both the early and late parts of it. Don't even get me started on the middle of the 20th century. Anyway, escargots were basically snails that were imported from French shores and sold for a few bucks when they touched down here. Premier French restaurants in New York would always have this as one of their finest aspects of French appetizers, and it was definitely popular with the rich crowd. It wasn't really all that good to most people because it was a bit out of touch with the kind of taste palettes and flavor profiles that were jibing with the American people back then, because a lot of people had different tastes. I don't mean that in the general different strokes for different folks kind of way. I mean that as a result of rationing for years and then foraging and living off of vegetable soups and stews, people had gotten more accustomed to things like potatoes, greens, and squirrel meat. So there wasn't much of a demand for snails to shine with the mass public anyway. Where they did get some value was in places like Le Pavillon and La Côte Basque in New York, which would only cater to the elite and were known as being strong footholds of French cooking in America. During the Great Depression, things like Clam's Casino were considered a part of what was known as haute cuisine and high-end dining because of their rarity and price. A lot of fancy eating back then was actually just for status, and the heavy pricing of most of these dishes is what attracted a lot of the kind of gentry that would frequent high-end restaurants in the first place. Clam's Casino was a clam-based dish that was first made in the early 1900s at the casino at Narragansett Pier, which is located in Rhode Island. Ever since its inception, it's only continued to go upwards in terms of price, which kind of speaks to the name it made for itself. The dish involves very five-star quality strips of bacon. A lot different from your usual diner dish, that's for sure. Top it off with seasoned breadcrumbs and shellfish, and you have a pretty tasty dish around baked clams. Not the most popular thing to make the centerpiece of a recipe, but this definitely accomplished everything it tried to do flavor-wise. It was smoky, savory, and just appetizing enough to work great as an entree. Veal cutlets were known for their tenderness. The more soft a cut of meat is, the more prized it becomes, and these would easily go for 60 to 80 cents for a pound, which still made it a luxury item. You know, on a side note, it really is jarring how different prices were back in the day. Nowadays, $8 to $10 for a coffee is considered pretty regular pricing, but back then, you had premium cuts of meat for literal cents, and that was still unaffordable to most normal people. That just goes to show that access to fine ingredients like veal cutlets, truffles, and fancy imported clams was a hobby that only the rich had the luxury and room to partake in. Italian restaurants exclusively catered to people like that, so it makes sense that they would always line their menus with things that made the best use of the most luxury ingredients. It seems that the Depression didn't affect everyone as brutally or equally. What really puts it into perspective for me is that these dishes don't sound that unaffordable on their own, but piece it together with an appetizer, a fancy dessert, and some luxury wines, and you're looking at somebody spending upwards of $20 to $30 or even $40 on a single meal plan. That's a lot of money for a time when the country's nearing bankruptcy. Suckling pig is probably one of the most severe offenders on the list. I say offenders like we're judging them for eating, but it's just a bit of the same tangent as before. Things like suckling pigs were so out of reach for most of the population that the idea of somebody enjoying this during the Depression seems like some kind of booze-induced fever dream. A suckling pig involved an entire roasted pig served and stuffed with several fillings, which themselves were made out of pricey stuff, so the entire preparation process, both the main and additional parts, attached a pretty hefty price tag to this dish. It was really rare to get an entire pig unless you had hunted one down. It was even rarer to put in all that effort and prep work for this meal, but it was how the wealthy celebrated a good day, occasion, or party, which were still thrown frequently, by the way. Their balls and banquets never really ceased. It was definitely a dish that was only reserved for the affluent crowd, and if there was a wedding in rich families, you could definitely expect this as a dish. It's just kind of comical, because you only really think of an entire pig being roasted and served as a sight you'd see in a cartoon. Lamb was a pretty expensive meat, all things considered back then. I mean, lamb will still run you upwards of $6 to $10 per pound if you go for reasonable markets, but back then, it was really rough. People were counting whatever cents they had left, so the only people that weren't rich but were eating lamb were the ones that came from cultures of hunting and lived in southern states. Plus, the way they had lamb was way different than the way rich people were having it. For the bourgeoisie, just a lamb roast wasn't enough. They'd make lamb chops with all these fine selections of herbs and nicely curated gravies and sauces. Reductions, bechamel sauces, glazes, and mixing elite wines into the food to let it braise and absorb flavor are all common ways of enjoying lamb chops for the rich. Delmonico's was a place I already spoke about, but this place was like the poster boy for rich people dining. It was where all the fanciest of families gathered. People with big names, companies, resumes, and even bigger bank accounts. They'd always enjoy lamb chops there, and it wasn't the only establishment that was still catering to the idea of serving high-end, exquisite lamb. Something that really vanished along with the 1900s was the idea of using turtles in food. Specifically, I'm talking about a kind of broth known as turtle soup, which sounds as weird to me as it does to you, but bear with me here. Turtle soup was actually considered an extreme luxury in the American South, and its meat was valued at around $2 to $3 per pound. Not only was high-quality turtle meat rare to find, it was a chore to prepare and properly source too. That's part of what made it cost that much, because to hire the right people to even get turtle meat you can use for a professional food experience, you were looking at some pretty labor-intensive work, and that, of course, cost places accordingly. Turtle soup was further prepared with sherry or Madeira wine, which were respectable brands themselves, so it only made this even more inaccessible to the normal folk of America back then. Turtle soup was still something only fine dining places and five-star hotels had on their menus, and it wasn't something you'd ever expect to know or taste if your salary was still in five figures. There was a big cultural difference to speak of besides just the acquired taste for unconventional meats like squirrel and turtle, both on the opposite ends of the price spectrum. That was the entire idea of seasonal food. Basically, things like asparagus, which were really seasonal vegetables, were prized and priced much higher than other things. You notice this with berries and oranges too, right? That seems pretty weird to think about, since nowadays a lot of these things are wildly inexpensive because if they aren't in season, you can always find frozen or canned versions of them. However, in the Depression, that kind of innovative technology hadn't come around yet or become mainstream. I mean, people were still using ice boxes to store their meat. As a result, if something was seasonal, that made it all the more expensive. For this reason, asparagus cost 20 to 40 cents per bunch and was usually served with quality butter as an appetizer. It was also only available during the spring, which is when a lot of harvests pop up, and people's wallets are already spread thin between all the seasonal produce they end up buying. So the common folk definitely had nothing to spare for asparagus, but the wealthy enjoyed appetizers made with it very often. Artichokes were in the same vein of ingredients that asparaguses were, because they were also really seasonal ones that you could only get in California. At least the best quality ones only came out of there. That meant other states in America were usually importing artichokes from there, so a bunch of artichokes in California might run you 10 to 20 cents. But in other states, it may cost twice that to cover up the costs of importing. It was also one of those ingredients you needed skilled labor for, because you couldn't work with the delicacy of artichokes if you didn't know your way around one. Most dishes that made use of it anyway involved a lot of French-inspired methods like steaming and using hollandaise sauce or premium butter and herbs. That meant that only the finest of places were serving artichokes. Even if others could have afforded it, they may not have had the expertise to know how to get the best use out of what they got. Artichokes were also more common in cities with upscale markets, and out-of-season artichokes would be almost triple the normal price, especially during the recession when price gouging was getting really common among those same markets. Have to pay the bills somehow, right? Of course, if you are going to indulge in the finer things in life with truffles, artichokes, and veal cutlets, you definitely need to have a drink of the same caliber, right? And what about celebrations, important birthdays, anniversaries, and lonely Sundays? It's not like the rich had to worry about money, so these were all valid concerns for them. Concerns which they answered with some of the finest champagne you could get in the world back then. Names like Moet and Chandon Dom Pérignon, which debuted in the 1930s, were popular bottles to see in the wine cellars of the rich and affluent. It was definitely a drink for an exclusive club, and it wasn't the only one of its kind. A lot of the cream of the crop of the upper class had rich people's hobbies, things only they had access to that others couldn't really dream of seeing. One of those was wine collecting, and when you have enough generational wealth, that hobby doesn't seem so unreasonable. Veuve Clicquot, Pommery Champagne, Piper Heidsieck, and many more brands were really choice picks for the well-off. Hotels and restaurants also still kept stocks of them just because they knew that the market for them was at least still thriving with the rich, and that part of America hadn't recessed. I know we went over how expensive lamb had become in the Depression, and that was with price cuts too, because most places found themselves having surpluses of stock. I mean, rich families ate, sure, but they were only so much of the market. The biggest customer base had no purchasing power for these things. As a result, dishes that made use of a lot of lamb became slightly more common. It was because they were serving and cooking for a smaller overall market that they could use their lamb this way. Otherwise, restaurants would probably go for more minimalist dishes. Anyway, racks of lamb were some of the most popular plates of the meat you could find. A rack of lamb was considered proper luxury eating because the rib bones were really tender, and it had quite a lot of lamb. They were priced at $1 or $2 a pound, and when you add the labor of the chefs to that, the cost only starts going up. Most preparation methods were based on French cooking, like rôti de carré d'agneau. Places in America with heavy European immigrant presences would also have a stronger demand for these because of how used to it they were, but you couldn't even find lamb in most normal butcher stores back then. You'd have to go to specialty shops the same way you'd go to them for brie cheese. I know you already caught on to this, but notice how almost everything here is imported. It really shows how much America was reliant on outside sources for fulfilling its food dreams and needs. And how importing even managed to survive back in the day and still be such a heavily active part of the economy is beyond me. I mean, wines and fruits, I can get. But they even had imported olive oil back then, man. That too from, like, the best places in Italy and Spain, where even if you went to markets in those countries and got it, it would still cost you a decent amount of money. A bottle of some genuine grade A high-quality imported olive oil costed around $1 a quart, which meant you were paying $10 to $20 for that amount in today's money. That's a lot for something that's heavily used in most dishes that Americans love to eat at restaurants, and actually, almost everything that I've mentioned on this list was usually cooked in olive oil. It was this kind of stuff that really sealed the deal on the entire idea of fine dining for middle-class people. If it really was just the MVP of the dish that you were paying a big cut of your check for, then it would still be somewhat justifiable at certain points of the year to splurge on good food. It wasn't just that, though. The appetizers, the main course, the prep for the main course, the skill of the high-end chefs, the costs of the ingredients, you were paying for all of it. And that just meant places that made use of things like this were completely a no-go zone for most working-class folks. Deviled crab is a wonderful example of that exact point. See, just like I was saying, it wasn't just the crab you were paying for, and they were already using some pretty expensive variants of the protein, like blue crab or lump crab meat, which cost 50 to 75 cents per serving. It was the herbs, the sauces, the drinks you had along with it, and the cut for the fishermen came out of your bill too. Seafood places suffered a lot during the Depression because they obviously just lost a lot of their clientele in the middle-class category, but as a result, a lot of them went all in and doubled down on the premium dining aspect of their branding, attracting more and more rich folk to cover up the costs. Places like the Oyster Bar in New York were fine examples of restaurants that served dishes exclusively for a wealthier customer base, like deviled crabs. To be fair, though, deviled crabs were thriving as a dish even before the Depression, so it was easier to retain demand for them. Just comes with the perks of being one hell of a dish, I guess. By the way, just for comparison's sake, poor and middle-class people were stuck to crawfish and sardines or whatever they could catch in rivers during the day, and that was as far as their idea of seafood would go. Crème brûlée is one of the best things to put on this list because I can't think of a better example of French haute cuisine. Sure, now they're commonplace. I mean, about 3 out of 10 home chefs on MasterChef show you a banging crème brûlée that your local restaurant on the corner can't match. That wasn't always the case, though. It took a long while for this dish to place its roots as firmly as it has. It started out as a dish reserved for the rich because it was considered really labor-intensive, used specific techniques and high-end ingredients, and was already at the forefront of French desserts, which meant that it was one of the most commonly known and demanded items. As a result, even as a dessert, this almost cost as much as your main course. You were looking at $1 to $2 for a good custard, which is pretty insane in 1930 prices. Lobster thermidor is the last thing on our list, and probably the most fitting dish to end this topic on. It encompasses everything I've talked about so far. How the rich were the only people who could afford things that went the entire 9 yards. Even when poor or middle-class people splurged on food during the Depression, it was one key ingredient that got a lot of love, and the whole dish was built around it to make it shine, like pot roasts. However, with rich people, every aspect of the dish was something that was out of normal people's price ranges. Lobster thermidor would be cooked in a cream-heavy sauce, and most people had given up on getting cream. It was made with egg yolks, brandy, and mustard, then topped with good quality cheese, and it was already a luxury item even before the Depression. That was too pretty comfortably. After it, when only the richest could afford this regularly, its status as a sign of wealth only further strengthened. Each pound of lobster cost a pound or two, and one plate of this dish was for around $4 to $7, and this was supposed to be a competitive price. By the way, in today's money, that's around $60 to over $100, comfortably. Add to the fact that since this was a dish preserved for celebrations, even among the rich, it was accompanied with equally pricey appetizers, wines, and desserts, and you can see just how big the gap really was back then. Cabbage and noodles typically just looked like a pound of cabbage and a medium serving of noodles. More or less, it was not the most expensive dish, and you could enjoy a bowl by making it pretty quickly. Away from the pancake and pie-addled fanatics are admirers of noodles across the states. Everyone needs their cravings satisfied from time to time, even if the soaring prices spared no one. In some areas, cabbage and noodles was known as haluski. However, in most places, it was simply referred to as cabbage and noodles, the most typical Depression-era noodle recipe. It's a must-have that needed to be in your repertoire if you were to survive the times and not forget every taste you ever loved. Someone really needs to study how times like these bring out everyone's culinary creativity. Next up is the infamous garbage plate. Before you start raising eyebrows because of the name of this one, just hear me out. So this was basically a mishmash of whatever was on hand. Imagine a plate filled to the brim with macaroni salad, home fries, baked beans, and some kind of protein like sausage or ground beef. And don't forget the toppings: chili, onions, mustard, and your choice of hot sauce or ketchup. Sounds appetizing, right? The garbage plate originated in 1918, the garbage plate, and became the signature dish of Rochester. If you missed out on it, don't fret, because it's still served by numerous restaurants under names such as Rochester Plate, Trash Plate, or Simply Plate. This meal was a classic when wallets were tight back in the day and there weren't many gourmet options on hand. Plus, it had all the carbs and fats you needed to keep going through tough times, and the kids loved it. What's not to love about fries and macaroni? This dish is a classic example of don't judge a book by its cover, or in this case, by its name. Bean soup is different from the other soups on our list because, in contrast, bean soup was pretty simple to make. Dried red kidney beans in a thick soup made for a favorite of states like Idaho, where the dish originated from. You could find different ideas on the soup from house to house, as some had their vegetables as toppings and others had meats. Fred Dubois, who was Idaho's senator at one point, passed a bill that mandated the Senate restaurant to have bean soup on the menu every day. Definitely one way to start a movement if you ask us, but the trend definitely stuck around after it gained steam. It was an amazing way for low-income neighborhoods to eat healthy, but nowadays you would not find it in households, as beans are not really the go-to item for soups. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. Milk toast is exactly what the name suggests. Toasted to perfection bread dipped in milk with a generous slap of butter. On days when any meal you loved was unaffordable and getting up to cook something proper was dreadful, milk toast came through for many families. All you needed was some good fresh bread and a warm glass of milk to gorge on until you felt full. Milk toast quickly became one of the most popular breakfasts in the States, catering specifically to people below the poverty line who could not make most of the items on this list regularly. Nowadays, this might be considered a very vintage meal, the type to get kids asking you what century you might be from. But back then, it was something even working-class 20-year-olds would eat daily. Times have changed, and the breakfast of people in those socioeconomic classes is definitely different. Oatmeal went out the window, and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular, as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Prune pudding. Sounds delicious, right? Nothing unusual about this one. It was a classic hit. Prunes were a popular choice during the Depression because they were cheap, stored well, and were, well, let's just say, effective. Many prominent figures during the 1930s ate frugally, just as most Americans did during the Great Depression. To promote the support of frugal and thrifty eating, Eleanor Roosevelt served prune pudding at formal White House functions. And that's how prunes became all the rage. The fruit was cooked until soft, mashed up, mixed with water and sugar, and a bit of flour or cornstarch to thicken it up. This dessert might not win any beauty contests, but it was a sweet treat that many families enjoyed. Prunes are not the most, luxurious of items out there. I'm sure you pass by prunes in the grocery store without even glancing at them, but they were a lifesaver for our taste buds back in the day. You know what that calls for? A place for them in your cart next time you go grocery shopping. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Squirrel stew is also called Brunswick stew, which might be a more familiar name since it is very well known in the South. Squirrel stew typically has much more positive associations than the ones it is tied to in the Great Depression era. In some areas that were struck exceptionally badly, it was hard to get any kind of meat. Stews had already been made with tomatoes, onions, and other basic vegetables that were available, but they were missing protein. Using squirrel in stews began to be widely incorporated into the daily meals of families following the onset of the Depression. The poor neighborhoods relied on variations of this stew that worked with what they had for regular nutrition. You have to consider that these were families used to eating meat before the brunt of the era hit America, and so squirrel meat was a welcome change. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Here's a sandwich combo that might make you do a double take. Peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Yes, you heard that right. Before PB&J sandwiches became a thing, peanut butter and mayo sandwiches was all the rage. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this one tastes far better than it sounds. In the 1930s, peanut butter and mayonnaise were both affordable and readily available, making them a popular pairing. The creamy, salty peanut butter mixed with the tangy mayo created a unique flavor combination that some people swear by to this day. It might sound strange, but remember, during the Great Depression, you ate what you could afford, and this sandwich was cheap and filling. So, if you're feeling brave and want to try something new, make yourself a peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Who knows, you might discover a new guilty pleasure. Mock apple pie is another delicious dessert that clicked with masses across the nations during rough times. As apples were getting expensive, people were looking for cheaper alternatives. That is when the mock apple pie entered. Resemblance is one thing, but if the pie looks and tastes like it, then it might as well be an apple pie. Created using cheap and the nation favorite Ritz crackers, mixing those with some vanilla syrup, sprinkle some lemon and cinnamon to create a perfect home-baked pie fit to rival apple pie. The Depression era onwards really saw an explosion in its popularity. We cannot really blame people either. Fresh, juicy apples were in hot demand and short supply. The pie was just as cheap as Hoover stew and easy to make. Nowadays, of course, you would not find this in houses you go to, despite it being popular enough that Ritz had instructions on the back of the box on how to make it. Okay, this one is a bit of a curveball. Cold milk soup? But hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. Cold milk soup was a Depression-era staple, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This dish has Amish origins and was one of the most popular meals back in the day. It was also pretty simple to whip up. Take some milk, mix in sliced bananas, a bit of sugar, and sometimes even bread or other fruits. And there you have it, cold milk soup. It might not sound like much, but for many families, this was a quick and easy way to get some calories and nutrients, especially when fresh ingredients were hard to come by. The bananas added some natural sweetness, while the milk provided protein and fat. It was a simple, no-cook meal that could be thrown together in minutes and was perfect for those hot summer days when turning on the stove was the last thing you wanted to do. Hoover stew was one of those dishes that anyone could afford to make, so it is no wonder that the stew was a common item in the Great Depression. Hoover stew had two signature traits. It could feed the whole family, and you could have the dish without exceeding the monthly budget. As for the recipe, the dish involved using scraps and leftovers to increase savings and recycling in a time when households could not afford a lot. You did not need many spices, and you could easily use leftover meats. In an America where banks were going bankrupt and the job market was hopeless, the stew was a welcome addition. Obviously, it would be a popular choice among many households, as our older viewers might still remember. Fortunately, as economic stability came back, Hoover stew went away from tables in favor of more flavorful and varied stews. Okay, this next one sounds like some kind of alien food, but Milcorno was a Depression-era kitchen miracle. It was a government-invented mixture of cornmeal and dried milk powder, designed to be a cheap and nutritious substitute for more expensive foods. A research team led by Flora Rose developed Milcorno, Milkowato, and Milkweedo cereals in the early 1930s, and they were sold exclusively to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration for distribution to Americans impoverished by the Depression. It was claimed that by substituting Milcorno for flour and cornmeal, a family of 5 could eat for less than $5 a week. The best part about Milcorno was its versatility. You could use it as a base for porridge, bake it into cornbread, or even use it to thicken soups. And while it might not sound super exciting, Milcorno dishes could actually be pretty tasty with the right seasonings and a bit of creativity. With the rise of delicious cereals, there's no room for it in our diets now, but hey, no one's going to judge you if you want to give it a try. Depression cake has a name that catches your eye, but it also suits the type of dish it was. Sugar, butter, and eggs were getting much harder to obtain, and even milk would not remain an easily buyable item. This cake was thus made with a recipe that had to use none of that, which actually made it realistic enough to be applicable. Following the 1929 crash of the market, all of the normal cake ingredients soared in prices. Bakeries quickly created an alternative recipe, and aptly named it Depression Cake. The recipe used baking powder, water, and butter, instead of the other ingredients typically necessary for any basic cake that people are used to eating today. This was a cake that set a precedent in that era because it would inspire things like the mock apple pie. The trend of mock food is almost completely gone nowadays, but for families that wanted to still have cake, this came close enough. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. All right, let's talk about a real comfort food of the Depression: bean in tomato stew. Beans were a go-to ingredient during the Depression days because of how nutritious, affordable, and versatile they are. It's basically just what it sounds like: beans cooked in a tomato-based broth. But you could also throw in potatoes, carrots, and maybe even a little bit of rice for extra substance. The beans provided a good source of protein and fiber, while the tomato sauce added a burst of flavor. This stew could be enjoyed on its own or served over rice, bread, or even mashed potatoes if you were lucky enough to have them. Originally, Native Americans sweetened baked beans with maple syrup, but then someone decided to turn this protein into a stew, and hey, we're not complaining. It was a filling meal back in the day, and it's still cooked in many households around America where the budget is a bit too tight. I know this dish might sound plain, but believe me, when your belly is rumbling and your pantry is bare, this stew can be a lifesaver. In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Next up, a dish that sounds almost too simple to be true: tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. I know, it doesn't exactly scream gourmet, but remember, we're talking about a time when people were just trying to survive. This combo was a way to stretch those precious few ingredients. During the Great Depression, potatoes were a cheap and filling staple, and tomato sauce was an easy way to add flavor. This dish was essentially a plate of creamy mashed potatoes topped with a savory tomato sauce. It might sound a bit unusual, but this combination was a hit because it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. Plus, potatoes were versatile. You could mash them, fry them, or bake them depending on what you had. So, if you're ever in the mood for a simple yet tasty meal, try tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. Let's see if this humble dish can impress our modern taste buds. Let's kick things off with a classic Depression-era stew. Now, this wasn't your fancy beef stew. It was more like a throw everything in the pot kind of deal. We're talking potatoes, carrots, onions, and maybe some barley if you were lucky. And the meat? Well, if you had any, great. If not, no worries. It's also known as mulligan stew or hobo stew and was originally created by American hobos in camps in the early 1900s. During the Great Depression, homeless men would sleep in a hobo jungle. Traditionally, the jungle would have a large campfire and a pot into which each person would put a portion of their food to create a shared dish that was, hopefully, more tasteful and varied than his original portion. It made you feel like you were getting a real meal, even if it was mostly broth. Yeah, the next time you need to clean out your fridge, channel your inner 1930s chef and whip up some Depression-era stew. You might just find a new favorite comfort food. Oatmeal cakes are a warm, fuzzy childhood dish that many might associate with visits to their grandparents. Failing economy on one side and grandma spoiling her favorite niece and nephew on the other. You just know they will always find a way, and lucky enough for us that the people of the times did it so craftily. In 35 minutes, you had a wondrous dessert to yourself that was quick enough to make after long, panic-filled days. Canned oatmeal on a soft cake glazed with an almond or peanut topping really set hearts on fire. Despite the cake's popularity back then, especially in the fitness and health community, it still did not stand the test of the time. Of course, it is a great way to spice up your oatmeal, regardless of how other breakfasts prepared with more culinary liberties taken would eventually replace it. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Corned beef hash was another famous dish similar to the ones we have been talking about on this list. Food analysts all over the world associate corned beef hash with Great Depression cuisine, as it was a way to get out of the patterns of mock foods and instead be a cheap and unique dish. Unfortunately, the meal was not that great or beloved, though it provided necessary vegetables and protein, so it gained popularity. Thick gravy in a cheap, widely available can suddenly became the go-to food for many households. When you think of beef, keep in mind that this meant anything from what was on hand, whether that was a fresh can of beef or leftovers from the last soup you had. Corned beef hash was also on the menus of diners around the states where you could get beef hash for as low as 75 cents, though those restaurant prices are in the distant past. Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. Creamed chipped beef on toast, however, was a more happening kind of toast-based breakfast. Particularly fancy and skillful home cooks would smoke the meat sometimes to add a better BBQ flavor. Thin slices of beef in glass jars were all you needed, which were not too expensive, and the rest of the dish was completed with a creamy, thick white sauce. Meat lovers would use cayenne pepper, remembering days where they could spray it on their steaks instead of their toast. Comfort food was really lacking in the Depression times because most could not make theirs. Creamed chipped beef on toast was a wonderful replacement that we are still sad to see fade away to history. Depending on where you were, the dish was more rare because you would most often see it in middle to upper middle class households. Beef really was expensive back then, but nowadays lots of other beef-based breakfasts took its spot. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup. Especially in the winters, when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a back seat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil. A dash of salt and you were good to go at basically no cost. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Then came the cornmeal mush, joining pies and stews on the list of economically sensible lunches. When times are tough, porridges become a very enticing meal, as affording bacon strips or other meats for breakfast was out of the question. Even if you got cheap beef jerky, you did not know if it was good and clean meat, and typical American breakfasts like grilled bacon and eggs were losing popularity due to price constraints. People needed their 7 a.m. nutrition, so cornmeal mush, an incredibly healthy dish, became popular. Topping the cornmeal with maple syrup, or in some cases a thick sausage gravy, elevated it in the taste department. It was not much of a fan favorite though, because the mush did not last long after the economy settled. Once people could afford better, they definitely went back to their regulars. With that, we wrap up our list of food only rich people would eat during the Great Depression. If you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe for more.